Okay, thank you, Tom. So I'm going to talk about excise duties. Now, the Chancellor often chooses to tinker with these taxes at budgets and autumn statements, with the reforms often being sold as good news for motorists or beer drinkers. But this obscures the fact that there's actually some serious economics underpinning these taxes, and they also raise a lot of revenue. In the most recent tax year, the duties on fuel, tobacco and alcohol raised just under £50 billion, or around 7% of total UK tax receipts. However, the revenue from these taxes is in fact in decline. So what this chart is going to show is the percentage raised from, in turn, tobacco, alcohol and fuel duties as a share of national income. So what we can see is that revenue from tobacco duties has more than halved over the last 30 years. And this is due to the fact that there's been a sharp decline in the number of people smoking. We can see a similar fall in the trends for revenue raised from alcohol duties, whereas if we look at fuel duties, although there was an increase from around the late 1970s to the turn of the century, it has in fact been broadly falling since then. And in fact, these trends are predicted to continue to fall over the next Parliament. And these declining revenues makes this an opportune time to think about the structure of these taxes. And another thing that has been the subject of debate recently is the possibility of introducing a new tax on sugar in order to combat the rising problems of obesity. Now, so to begin today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the guiding principles that should underpin any system of excise taxation, then move on to think in a bit more detail about the taxes applied to both motoring and alcohol, and then finally to conclude by thinking about what some of the issues are surrounding the proposed sugar tax. So the justification for having additional taxes on certain goods that are levied in addition to VAT is that consumption of these goods generates social costs not taken into account by the individual when choosing how much to consume. So these include, for example, the effects of passive smoking on non-smokers, the cost of policing and the emergency services through alcohol-fueled violence, and there may also be costs borne by the individual at some point in the future that they don't take into account when deciding how much to drink or smoke. So these include the increased risk of heart disease, cancers, or in fact stroke associated with smoking and drinking. And if these social costs exist, then we can in fact use corrective taxes in order to try and reduce the consumption to a socially optimal level. Now, the broad idea of these taxes is to raise the price that consumers face in order to take into account these social costs of consumption. Now, while this is simple to describe, in practice the issues are more complex. It's both difficult to measure what these social costs are, and it's also the case that these social costs are likely to vary, both depending on who's consuming the good and how much they might have consumed. Nonetheless, this is what we should be thinking about when designing a system of excise taxes. So now moving on to motoring taxes. Now, fuel duty and vehicle excise duty raise in excess of £30 billion of revenue a year. And the justification for this is that there are social costs associated with motoring. And the first of these is the problem of emissions. So vehicle emissions contribute to general air pollution, and also the carbon produced contributes to climate change. Now, fuel duty is reasonably well targeted at this social cost. So the more you drive, the more fuel you use, the more emissions you produce, and therefore the more tax you pay. However, if we look at what the implied carbon tax rates are from the duties applied to petrol and diesel, we see they're greatly in excess of the values attached to carbon savings by the UK government, and also to the implied carbon taxes from other forms of energy use, such as domestic heating. And so what this suggests is that actually if emissions are the only source of social cost imposed by motoring, then this suggests that the taxes are currently too high. On the other hand, there's actually a much bigger problem with the way in which motoring is taxed, and that's the fact that there is in fact another social cost generated by motorists, which is that of congestion. So there are estimates that congestion accounts for roughly 2/3 of the social costs of motoring. Now, both fuel duty and vehicle excise duty are very poorly targeted at the problem of congestion. So if you use the same amount of fuel, you pay the same amount of tax, regardless of whether or not you drive at a busy time. In addition to this, over the last few years, there's been a big increase in the fuel efficiency of new cars. And these trends in the costs of driving a given kilometre have in fact been falling even more since the recent declines in the oil price. Now, the Chancellor might want to think carefully about what the effects of further reductions in fuel duty might have on the problem of congestion. Now, another thing to think about is that there's another way to tackle congestion. And we can do this via a system of road pricing. Now, the idea behind such a system will be to incentivise motorists to drive at less congested times and on less congested routes. Now, such a system would replace much of the revenue currently raised through fuel duty and vehicle excise duty, and these taxes would remain, albeit at much lower rates, in order to make sure that carbon emissions are correctly priced. So what I'm going to do now is move on to thinking about the taxes applied to alcohol. Now, as with motoring, the justification for taxing alcohol in excess of the VAT applied to it is that there are certain social costs generated by alcohol consumption, at least by some alcohol consumption. Now, a reasonable starting point for a system of alcohol taxes is to tax each unit of pure alcohol the same regardless of what form it comes in. So a unit of beer would be taxed the same as a unit of whiskey, for instance. Now, this kind of makes sense if we think that the social cost generated by consuming a unit of pure alcohol is the same regardless of what type of thing you're drinking. But it's actually the case that the social costs vary quite considerably across people. So think about the example of a heavy drinker deciding whether or not to consume his 10th pint on a Friday night versus the case of someone simply choosing to have 2 rather than 1 glasses of wine a week. You know, we would likely think that the consumption of the first guy is much higher than the social costs generated by the second. And so what we can do is use the fact that heavy drinkers buy different types of products to lighter and more moderate drinkers in order to better target the tax system at their consumption. So heavy drinkers buy a greater proportion of their alcohol in the form of high-strength spirits. And this suggests that we should have relatively higher taxes on high-strength products. So how does the current tax system compare to these ideals? Well, the answer is not particularly well. So alcohol taxes depend on both the type of alcohol and how strong it is. Now, this is in part dictated by EU rules. So whereas beer and spirits are taxed per unit of pure alcohol in the product, wine and cider duties are levied per litre of product. And actually, this acts to create a fairly incoherent system of alcohol taxation. So what this picture is going to show is the tax levied per unit of alcohol, depending on whether or not the product is wine, spirits, beer, or cider, and how this varies by how strong the alcohol is. So what we see is that the tax schedule for beer is relatively sensible in that higher strength beers are taxed more than lower strength beers. The schedule for spirits is constant but at a higher level than that of beer. Now it's for wine that we start to see some oddities in the system. So this is an artifact of the fact that wine is taxed per litre rather than per unit of alcohol. And what this means is that higher strength wines, broadly speaking, are taxed less per unit than lower strength wines. And we see some really odd discrepancies of the system, which means that very different amounts of tax are levied on otherwise very similar products. But perhaps the biggest anomaly is for cider. Now, cider, again, is like wine, taxed per litre, but it also has a much lower tax rate than other types of alcohol. So higher strength ciders actually get taxed a lot less per unit than lower strength ciders. And this leads to some really odd discrepancies in the tax system. So if we look at how much tax a 7.5% strength litre of beer is liable for, and we see it gets about 140 pence of tax. And in comparison, a litre of 7.5% cider attracts only 40 pence of tax. Now, there's really no economic justification for these differences. We would have to think that someone who's drinking a pint of beer generates 3 times the amount of social harm as someone who's drinking a pint of cider that contains exactly the same amount of alcohol in it. Another thing about the current tax system is that higher strength products are really not systematically targeted. And this has been exacerbated by the fact that over the last 30 years or so, there's really been a long-run decline in the real level of duty levied on spirits, and it's now roughly half the level that it was in the late 1970s. And this really begs the question, why are we taxing why are we taxing less the products that are predominantly drunk by heavy drinkers and who are precisely the people that we want to reduce the alcohol consumption of? Now, another policy that's garnered quite a lot of attention for its supposed ability to target the problems of heavy drinking is a minimum unit price. Now, the motivation for this policy is that heavy drinkers do in fact buy more of their alcohol in the form of cheap units. And this suggests that a minimum unit price might be reasonably well targeted at reducing their alcohol consumption. But there are some caveats to this. And the first is that a minimum unit price introduces a price floor, which in fact lessens competition in the alcohol industry and is in fact likely to lead to windfall profits for both alcohol manufacturers and retailers. And it's precisely because of these competition concerns that it is facing legal challenges in the European Court of Justice. Now, you might say, well, we could just leave the European Union, or we could in fact reform the tax system in such a way that it would target the products bought by heavy drinkers, so these are high-strength spirits, and this could be done in a way that wouldn't fall foul of EU law. But a really key thing to remember here is that, the really key thing to remember here is that the effects of these policies are going to depend crucially on how consumers respond to price. So we need to think about how heavy drinkers versus moderate drinkers are going to respond to these policies that change prices in order to understand how effective they're going to be. And this is in fact the subject of some ongoing IFS research which is going to be published in the spring. So now I'm going to wrap up by thinking about a tax that we don't yet have, and this is a tax on sugar. Now, according to many public health bodies, we are eating too much sugar. So there's concern about the cost of excess sugar consumption, so it's been linked with rising obesity levels, concern about its association with tooth decay and diabetes, and there's particular concern about the effects that it has on children. More than 90% of households currently buy in excess of the recommended 5% of their calories in the form of added sugar. And this has led various public health bodies to call for policies that might attempt to reduce people's sugar consumption. So these include a tax on sugar in soft drinks. Now, this might seem like a reasonable starting point. Soft drinks don't contain any other nutrients, and therefore a switch away from them is unlikely to adversely affect diet in other dimensions. But it's not a silver bullet. Even if we were able to reduce sugar consumed from these soft drinks to zero, 88% of households would still purchase more than the 5% recommended level of calories from added sugar. And in fact, it's quite likely that people would substitute to both chocolate and sweets if in fact a tax was levied on sugary fizzy drinks. An alternative policy that the government could consider would be a broader base tax which applies to a wider range of products. But again, this is more complex than it might actually appear. The first thing is that food products contain bundles of nutrients, and therefore it's really difficult to affect the consumption of any one nutrient without also affecting the consumption of others. So in response to a tax on sugar, people may very well substitute away from sugary products, but if they switch towards things that are high in salt or saturated fat, then this could in fact lead to an ambiguous effect on overall diet quality. Another thing to note is that firms may in fact not pass on the tax one-for-one to retail prices, and they may choose to change the prices of products that are not directly taxed under the new sugar tax. They may also choose to reformulate their food products in response to a tax. So a positive effect of this might be that they actually reduce the sugar content of their food products. But if they choose to replace this with salt, then again, this could lead to an adverse impact on diet in other dimensions. I think the thing to remember here is there are a whole host of policy options available to government, and really careful consideration should be given to which is the most appropriate at tackling the social costs in this case. So just to wrap up, excise taxes have long been the subject of tinkering by the Chancellor, and as a result, the taxes applied to both motoring and alcohol are a mess. And really, it's now time to think carefully about how the current system of taxes are designed, and also about the setting up of any new tax on sugar. So thank you. I'm now going to pass you on to Rob.